Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text.
Usually when we talk about preparing a patient for surgery, there's this expectation of visibility.
Right, like you can see what's coming.
Exactly. It's like checking the weather before a flight. You look at the lab results. You check their airway. You listen to their heart.
You can see the storm clouds right there on the chart.
Yeah. You know exactly what you're flying into.
Well, it's quantifiable, right? The risks are physical and measurable before the patient even enters the operating room.
But then you step into the really complex world of perioperative medicine, and you realize the radar isn't always reliable.
Oh, not at all.
Sometimes the radar is completely clear, but the storm is actually already inside the house.
That is a great way to put it.
So if you are a college student just starting to wrap your head around the sheer complexity of anesthesia, welcome to the deep dive. Today we are looking at those invisible storms. Specifically, we're unpacking Chapter 18 of Stolching's Anesthesia and Coexisting Disease, which covers inborn errors of metabolism.
And I'd argue these are some of the most dangerous conditions you'll ever encounter in the OR.
Because of the latency, right?
Exactly. The unifying theme here is latency. These defects, which are essentially, tiny genetic typos, they're often completely asymptomatic.
I mean, a patient could live for decades and have literally no idea they have one of these conditions.
Right. The trap is set, but it doesn't spring until a very specific trigger tips the scale.
And in our world, that trigger is often the stress of surgery itself, or preoperative fasting, or scariest of all, the very anesthetic drugs we administer.
Which is terrifying if you don't know what you're looking for.
So our mission today is to completely unpack these metabolic landmines. We're going to walk through this chapter exactly in order, starting with Table 18.1.
That table gives us the big picture. Porphyria, Purine metabolism disorders, carbohydrate disorders, hemochromatosis, and Wilson disease.
Right. And we are going to connect the dots from the microscopic pathophysiology of those diseases straight to the surgical risks.
Because just memorizing a list of safe and unsafe drugs isn't enough. You have to know how to evaluate and optimize the patient beforehand.
Yeah, and the exact intraoperative and postoperative decisions you need to make. Like, why is one drug totally safe while another could be lethal?
If you don't know the why, you're just flying blind.
So true. So, let's start with a condition that perfectly illustrates this. Porphyria. Figure 18.1 maps out the heme biosynthetic pathway.
Heme is so critical. It's the core of hemoglobin, which carries oxygen in our blood.
And it's essential for cytochrome P450, right? The enzyme system our liver uses to metabolize drugs.
Exactly. Now, the textbook gives us this incredibly dense map of how the body makes heme, but let's visualize it a bit differently.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine a factory assembly line, and the sole purpose of this factory is to manufacture heme.
I love a good factory analogy.
Right. So every assembly line needs a foreman to dictate the pace of the work. In this mitochondrial factory, the foreman is an enzyme called ALA synthase.
ALA meaning aminolevulinic acid.
Yes, aminolevulinic acid. It's the very first building block, the raw material that goes onto the assembly line.
So if I'm understanding the feedback loop, the foreman looks at how much finished heme is sitting in the warehouse.
Right.
And if the warehouse is full, the foreman tells the assembly line to slow down.
Standard negative feedback loop, exactly.
But what actually goes wrong in a patient who has porphyria?
Well, there is a specific enzyme deficiency somewhere further down that assembly line.
Okay.
Let's say a patient with this hidden defect undergoes the stress of surgery. Their body suddenly demands more heme.
So the foreman, ALA synthase, yells, "Speed up the line, we need more product."
Precisely. Yep. The front half of the assembly line goes into massive overdrive, pumping out tons of that raw material, ALA.
But because there's a broken machine, that missing enzyme down the line, the final product isn't getting made fast enough.
And because the finished heme isn't arriving in the warehouse, the foreman never gets the signal to stop.
Oh, wow. So ALA synthase just keeps pushing.
It does. You get a massive bottleneck. All these half-finished products, specifically porphyrin intermediates, start piling up on the factory floor.
And in the human body, when those specific intermediates pile up, they become highly toxic.
Exactly.
So looking at tables 18.2 and 18.3, I noticed porphyrias are classified in a couple of ways. Table 18.2 splits them by anatomy, whether the pileup happens in the liver, which is hepatic, or the red blood cells, which is erythropoietic.
Yes, that's the anatomical split.
But honestly, as an anesthesiologist, do I need to worry about that anatomical split when I'm managing an airway?
For a biochemistry exam?
Sure.
For clinical practice in the OR? Not really.
Okay, good to know.
For us, Table 18.3 is what matters. The functional classification. You divide them into acute versus non-acute forms.
Because only the acute forms cause life-threatening reactions to perioperative drugs, right?
Exactly. With the non-acute forms, things like porphyria cutanea tarda or erythropoietic protoporphyria, your anesthetic drugs are generally safe.
You just manage them like a normal patient, basically.
Right, maybe just being extra mindful of their liver function.
Okay, so if I'm looking at a chart, which of the acute forms should make my heart skip a beat?
The most terrifying one is acute intermittent porphyria. It's the most common and the most life-threatening.
And that's an autosomal dominant disorder on chromosome 11, right? A defect in porphobilinogen deaminase.
You got it. And what makes it so insidious is that this defect happens very early in that factory assembly line.
Meaning what, exactly?
Because it's so early, the precursors that pile up don't cause any skin disease. There are absolutely no outward physical signs before an attack. It is entirely invisible.
Wow. There are a few others too, right? Variegate porphyria on chromosome 1, which has some photosensitivity.
Yep.
And hereditary coproporphyria on chromosome 9, which has milder skin issues. But let's focus on that invisible attack. What actually triggers it?
Well, the list seems almost unfair because these are incredibly common in a hospital setting. Fasting before elective surgery, dehydration.
Oh, and infections, right?
Infections, stress, hormonal fluctuations like menstruation or pregnancy.
Basically, any of those stressors can signal the factory foreman to go into overdrive and cause that toxic pileup.
Exactly. And when the patient goes into an acute attack, the presentation is really baffling.
I read this in the text and it blew my mind. They develop severe, agonizing abdominal pain that completely mimics acute appendicitis.
Yes.
But when a surgeon presses on their abdomen, there's no rebound tenderness. The physical exam is entirely normal.
It's a phantom surgical abdomen.
I mean, I initially assumed the pain must be from an inflamed organ hiding behind the intestines or something, but that's not it at all, is it?
Not at all. The pain isn't inflammatory. It's neurological.
Wait, really?
Yeah. Remember that massive pileup of the ALA intermediate?
Mm-hmm.
It is profoundly toxic to the nervous system.
So it's poisoning the nerves directly.
Yes. It causes widespread autonomic neuropathy. That abdominal pain is literally their autonomic nervous system screaming.
Which explains the cardiovascular swings I was reading about. Their heart rate skyrockets, their blood pressure swings wildly from severe hypertension to sudden hypotension.
The nervous system is just misfiring on every single cylinder. Upper motor neuron lesions, cranial nerve palsies, you name it.
And that leads to the absolute top safety priority, skeletal muscle weakness.
Right. This neurotoxicity can rapidly progress to complete quadriparesis paralysis of all four limbs.
And if it reaches their diaphragm,
they stop breathing. Respiratory failure is what ultimately kills these patients.
That is absolutely terrifying. I also have to ask, there's this weird piece of medical lore in the text. You hear stories that porphyria is the origin of the werewolf myth.
Ah, yes.
The werewolf theory.
Like people going mad, bizarre psychiatric behavior. Is there any truth to that?
It's an interesting historical footnote, but honestly, it's largely a myth.
Oh, okay.
While the neurotoxicity can definitely cause seizures and some psychiatric disturbances, those classic, bizarre werewolf-style mental disorders are actually not very common. So the real monster here isn't a werewolf. It's respiratory paralysis.
Exactly.
Okay, so we know the stakes. How do we navigate this minefield? Let's look at Table 18.4, which categorizes drugs based on whether they trigger ALA synthase. Let's start with the bad list.
This hurts because it takes away some of our most common tools.
Right. Intravenous induction drugs like thiopental, thiamolol, methohexidyl, etomidate, and ketamine are strictly contraindicated.
You push ketamine, you could send them into a fatal crisis.
That's wild. What about pain management?
Ketorolac is BAD, amiodarone is BAD.
And calcium channel blockers are highly suspect, right? The text says each one must be individually verified.
Yes, because their chemical structures often contain ally groups, and those ally groups directly stimulate ALA synthetase.
So say a patient with acute intermittent porphyria starts seizing on the table from the neurotoxicity. I can't just push a standard anti-seizure medication, can I?
Absolutely not. Traditional anticonvulsants are unsafe. They will accelerate the factory assembly line and make the attack worse.
So what do I use?
You have to treat their seizures with a benzodiazepine or propofol.
Okay, well, that brings us to the okay list, which is a relief. Propofol is well tolerated.
Thank goodness for propofol.
Seriously. Standard inhalational anesthetics. Nitrous oxide, isoflurane, sevoflurane, desflurane, they're all okay. Dexmedetomidine is safe.
Neuromuscular blockers like succinylcholine and rocuronium are safe too. And they're reversals.
And local anesthetics are okay.
Which means regional anesthesia like spinals or epidurals is technically an option.
Wait, if local anesthetics are safe, why is everyone so nervous about doing an epidural on a porphyria patient? I feel like I've heard you shouldn't.
It's because of the disease's natural progression. Remember, the disease itself causes profound neurotoxicity and muscle weakness.
Oh, right, the paralysis.
So if you do an epidural without a meticulous, thoroughly documented baseline neurologic exam, and the patient wakes up with leg weakness.
How do you know if it's a complication from your epidural needle or the start of a porphyria crisis?
Exactly. You lose all your diagnostic clarity. You would end up blaming the block for a porphyria-induced neuropathy.
That makes perfect sense. So, preoperatively, how do we optimize them? I know fasting is a trigger because caloric restriction ramps up heme production.
Right, so the fix is straightforward. The patient absolutely must receive a preoperative glucose-containing infusion to keep the system quiet.
And for diagnosis, you check erythrocyte porphobilinogen activity.
Yes.
But what if we do everything right and they still go into a severe crisis intraoperatively?
First, remove the trigger, hydrate them. But really, you go straight to the definitive treatment. Heme therapy, things like hematin, hemalbumin, or hemarginine.
And going back to our factory analogy, this is so elegant. When you give them intravenous heme, you are essentially backing up a dump truck full of finished product and dropping it straight into the warehouse.
Yes. The foreman, ALA synthase, looks at the warehouse, sees it as suddenly overflowing with heme, and that negative feedback loop violently re-engages.
Shut down the line.
Precisely. It finally shuts down the overactive factory.
That is a brilliant mechanism. Okay, so we've seen how a metabolic defect can poison the nervous system. Let's move to a completely different kind of invisible trap.
One where the breakdown of normal molecules becomes the problem.
Right. We're shifting from the heme assembly line to purine metabolism. Let's talk about gout.
Okay, gout.
Now, when most people think of gout, they think of excess uric acid forming crystals, usually in a swollen, agonizing big toe.
The swollen toe is classic. But why does an anesthesiologist care about a swollen toe?
Right. It doesn't stop me from intubating someone, so what's the anesthesia implication?
Because the joints aren't the only place those crystals deposit. They precipitate heavily in the kidneys, causing nephrolithiasis, kidney stones, and chronic renal dysfunction.
And we rely on the kidneys to clear the drugs we administer.
Exactly. If the kidneys are damaged by uric acid, your drugs will linger in the body far longer than expected.
So our management focuses on protecting the kidneys, aggressive prehydration to keep them flushing.
And administering sodium bicarbonate.
To alkalinize the urine, right? Because that increases the solubility of the uric acid and helps flush it out.
I got it.
Now, there was another detail in the text that I found brilliant, a mechanical airway connection. Gout can severely affect the temporomandibular joint, the TMJ.
Yes, gouty arthritis in the jaw.
Which means it physically limits jaw motion. You go in for a routine direct laryngoscopy, and you suddenly find you can't even open their mouth to get the bleed in.
It turns a standard induction into a highly dangerous airway scenario.
Are there any other purine disorders that ruin the airway like that?
Yes, a condition called Lesch-Nyhan syndrome.
Okay, the textbook says this is a rare genetic disorder occurring in males, caused by hypoxanthine guanine phosphorybostransferase deficiency.
That is a mouthful, but yes. It causes a massive early-onset buildup of uric acid, often called juvenile gout.
But the clinical signs are brutal. Spasticity and self-mutilation. How does that impact surgery?
The reality is awful. The uncontrollable compulsion for self-mutilation means they frequently bite their lips and perioral tissues.
Oh, wow.
Over years, that constant trauma creates dense, rigid scar tissue all around the mouth.
Making intubation incredibly difficult. Just like with TNJ gout, you're fighting through unyielding scar tissue.
Exactly. Furthermore, their spasticity causes aethetoid dysphagia.
Meaning swallowing is hard.
Right. Their swallowing mechanism is entirely uncoordinated, so if they vomit under anesthesia, they cannot protect their airway. The aspiration risk is massive.
That is a sobering example of how an enzyme defect creates a structural nightmare. Let's pivot again, moving from purines to sugars. Let's look at carbohydrate metabolism disorders in Table 18.5.
The crucial ones to understand here are the glycogen storage diseases.
Specifically type 1A, which is von Gierke disease, a glucose 6 phosphatase deficiency, and type 1B, which involves a translocase inability.
The pathophysiology here is simple but terrifying. These patients cannot break down glycogen into glucose.
Okay, let's connect the dots. Normally, we store backup sugar in the liver as glycogen. When we fast, liver enzymes break it down into glucose to keep our brain working.
Right. But these patients are missing the enzyme for that final step.
So they can store it, but they can't access it.
Exactly. Which directly collides with one of the most fundamental rules of preoperative care, fasting. NPO past midnight.
Oh man. Therefore, even a short preoperative fast can induce lethal hypoglycemia.
And profound lactic acidosis as their body desperately tries to find alternative fuel.
So the management imperative is super strict. You minimize fasting, run continuous glucose infusions, and monitor arterial pH closely.
Yes. And you also have to watch out for bleeding.
Right. I read that the metabolic derangement causes poor platelet adhesiveness. They just don't stick together to form clots.
Exactly. It changes the whole playbook.
All right, we're finishing up the chapter with 2 diseases of toxic buildup. Not enzymes this time, but heavy metals. Iron and copper. Let's start with iron and hemochromatosis.
Hemochromatosis is total body iron overload. It can be primary, usually from a mutation in the HFE gene, leading to decreased hepcidin.
And hepcidin is the hormone that normally blocks excess GI iron absorption.
Right. So without it, massive iron absorption happens continuously.
And secondary hemochromatosis comes from endless transfusions, like for sickle cell or thalassemia, where the body has no way to excrete the extra iron.
Exactly. So this toxic iron builds up in the organs. Over decades, you see a classic triad of end organ damage appearing after age 40. Liver cirrhosis, pancreatic diabetes, and congestive heart failure.
And diagnosis involves a ferritin level over 1,000 milligrams per liter with a fasting transferrin saturation over 45%.
Right.
So what's the absolute do not do here for anesthetic management? Obviously, we tailor our drugs to their liver and heart failure, but what else?
The crucial safety priority is this. Whatever you do, avoid red blood cell transfusions if at all possible.
Wait, really? Even if they're bleeding?
You have to be incredibly conservative. Because what are red blood cells packed with? Iron.
Oh, man. So you are literally pumping more of the toxic agent into their body.
Exactly. You're adding fuel to the fire.
That is wild. Okay, finally, let's look at Wilson disease, a rare autosomal recessive disorder of copper transport.
Right. Copper builds up relentlessly in the liver and then overflows into the bloodstream.
And from there, it overflows into the brain and the heart.
Yes. The clinical presentation usually hits in the teenage years with acute liver failure.
And then the neuroscience hit. Parkinson-like tremors, dystonia, and those Kaiser-Fleischer rings, the brown rings around the cornea.
That's the copper literally depositing in the eye. But the real danger is in the brain. The copper destroys the basal ganglia.
So how does that baseline neurologic depression impact our anesthesia?
Well, because of that damage, anxiolytics and narcotics will have massively exaggerated effects.
And because their liver is failing, any drug metabolized by the liver will have sustained, prolonged effects too.
Exactly. Plus, the severe dystonia can make the physical administration of anesthesia very tricky, and their dysphagia increases aspiration risk.
But despite all that, regional and general anesthesia are both fundamentally safe, as long as you account for the organ damage.
Yes. You have to thread the needle carefully.
Threading the needle really is the perfect summary for Chapter 18. The logic here is beautiful, even if it's intimidating.
It really is.
I mean, how a tiny missing enzyme in the heme pathway, or a failure to process purines or sugars, or a buildup of iron or copper, how that totally dictates your entire preoperative airway and drug strategy.
It just proves you can never assume a patient is routine.
Truly. Now, to wrap up, we want to leave you with a final provocative thought to ponder. Let's look back at Table 18.4, the drug list for porphyria.
Right, the bad and okay lists.
Much of what we call safe or unsafe is actually based on cell cultures, animal models, or anecdotal history.
Because these diseases are so rare, we just don't have massive randomized controlled trials, which means there's a huge list of drugs categorized simply as no data.
So as an aspiring anesthesia provider, how will you handle that uncertainty? When a patient desperately needs a life-saving drug that falls right in the no data category, what do you do?
Weighing that invisible, theoretical genetic trap against the very visible storm happening on the monitor.
Yeah.
That's the real art of medicine.
It absolutely is. Well, thank you so much for joining us and starting with the last-minute lecture team. We hope this helps you take these concepts out of the textbook and confidently into the operating room.
Good luck out there.
See you next time on The Deep Dive.